Hello friends. Today I want to share with you one of those stories that stay with you for the rest of your life. This is not just another horror story at night. This is my personal story that happened a few years ago when I decided to visit my grandmother at her house in an abandoned village in the American Midwest. Something was always wrong in this place, but I could not imagine how terrible the events of that day would turn out to be. If you are ready to hear the truth that will make your heart beat faster, stay with me and don't forget to leave a comment after watching. Now, let's get started. A few years ago, when I was about 25, I received a call from my mom. She informed me that my grandmother, who lived alone in an old house in an abandoned village in the Midwest, was very ill. Grandma was already over 80, and she refused to move in with us, preferring to stay in the house where she had lived all her life. My mother asked me to go there and help my grandmother, to spend a few days with her until she recovers. I reluctantly agreed. My grandmother's house has always made me sad and anxious. The abandoned village where life once boomed was now a gloomy and empty place, overgrown with weeds, with leaning houses and empty streets. As a child, I liked to visit my grandmother, but over the years I began to feel that there was something strange about this. But at that moment, I attributed my feelings to imagination and anxiety. I arrived there the next day. The road leading to the village was littered with broken stones and holes, and the car was slowly shaking on every bump. When I finally reached my grandmother's house, I was greeted by complete silence. There was no sound except the wind rustling through the dried leaves. The house stood in the middle of a vast field, surrounded by dense forests, and looked completely empty. I got out of the car and headed for the porch, expecting to see my grandmother on the doorstep, as she used to greet me as a child. But this time she wasn't there. I entered the house, and I was immediately overcome by a feeling of anxiety. Inside, everything looked the same as it had decades ago. Antique furniture, darkened wallpaper, and old family photos on the walls. I went into the living room and called my grandmother. There was no response. The house was so quiet that I could only hear my own breathing. I went up to the second floor where my grandmother's bedroom was. She was lying on the bed, looking weak and exhausted, but her eyes lit up when she saw me. "Hi, honey," she said softly. "I'm glad you came." I sat down next to her and tried to smile, hiding my concern. We talked for a while, and she asked me to help with some household chores. During the day, I ran small errands, watered the garden, repaired several shelves, and cooked dinner. Grandma didn't eat much. She insisted that she needed to be alone for a while. It was already getting dark when I left her room. I was heading to the kitchen to clean up after dinner when I suddenly heard some noise from the street. I went to the window and saw the figure of a woman standing in the middle of the field. Her silhouette was barely visible in the dim light of the sunset. I couldn't figure out who it was, or why she was standing there alone, in the middle of an abandoned field. Perhaps it was just a neighbor. But something about her posture, the way she held her head, seemed strange and frightening. I went outside to find out what she was doing. As soon as I got closer, the woman began to slowly turn in my direction. When her face became visible, a chill ran down my spine. It was a young woman, but her face was lifeless, like a dead man. She had a large knife in her hands, and she was holding it at her wrist. I froze in place, unable to take my eyes off this terrible picture. There was something unnatural about her lifeless face and empty eyes, almost unreal, as if it were not a woman standing in front of me, but her shadow or ghost. At that moment, I wanted to scream, call out to her, or just run away, but I was paralyzed by terror. The woman, slowly, as if in some kind of trance, picked up the knife and brought it to her wrist. I couldn't believe my eyes. She was going to stab herself right in front of my eyes. In a panic, I took a step forward, shouting something unintelligible. She did not react. Her movements were so calm and cool that it seemed unreal. The blade of the knife glinted in the light of the setting sun as it sank into her flesh. Time seemed to slow down. I saw blood begin to ooze from the incision on her arm, thick and dark as tar. She didn't even flinch. continuing to cut her wrist with such calmness as if it was the most common thing in the world. I tried to approach her again, but my legs wouldn't obey me, and my heart was pounding so hard in my chest that it seemed like it was about to burst out. When I was finally able to take another step, the woman suddenly raised her eyes and looked directly at me. There was nothing but emptiness and hopelessness in her gaze, as if she had long since left this world. But something in those eyes was so eerie and eerily familiar that I froze in place, feeling an icy horror grip me. She slowly knelt down, continuing to cut her hand as if she didn't feel any pain. I wanted to scream, to run for help, but instead I stood transfixed, watching her agonizing self-destruction. All this time, she did not utter a sound, did not betray her suffering with a groan or a sigh. At some point, it seemed to me that her gaze had changed. She looked at me with a kind of strange, piercing regret, as if she was trying to say something, and suddenly, her hand with the knife froze. The woman slowly bowed her head and, without taking her empty eyes off me, collapsed to the ground. The officers approached her, examined her carefully, and, without saying a word, called the medical examiner. Everything that was happening seemed to me like some kind of strange dream. I stood on the sidelines, watching them do the inspection, ask questions, take pictures. But no matter what I said, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that there was something more behind it all. Something that I couldn't comprehend. Finally, one of the officers came up to me and asked me to testify. I told him everything I had seen, although my words still sounded confused and ridiculous. The officer listened to me with a serious expression on his face, nodding at the right moments, but I felt that he also did not understand what had happened here. When all the necessary formalities were completed, the officers informed me that the investigation would continue and asked me not to leave the city without warning. I agreed and thanked them for their help, although I felt completely alone in my heart. Couldn't sleep that night. The scene I saw kept popping up in front of my eyes, giving me no peace. It seemed to me that it was some kind of sign, something that I shouldn't have seen, but I did. But whatever it was, I knew one thing. After that day, my life would never be the same. A few weeks later, the police closed the case, declaring the incident a suicide. No one was able to identify the woman, and she was buried in an unmarked grave at a local cemetery. I tried to move on with my life, forget about everything, but it turned out to be impossible. Every night I woke up from the same nightmare. A woman stood in front of me, raising a knife to her wrist, and her eyes were full of the same incomprehensible horror. Now, years later, I still can't figure out what happened that night. Perhaps it was a coincidence, or I witnessed something much deeper and darker. But one thing I know for sure: that abandoned village and its empty streets will forever remain in my memory as a place where I encountered something that defies explanation.